Hey, it's Anne. I have another watercolor landscape tutorial for you today, and it's using a reference photo I took in Yosemite National Park. I'm going to go over the supplies. I used an 8x10 watercolor block cold press from Arche. I also have a large flat brush and a couple of smaller round brushes. I think they're sizes 0 through 6. The paint colors I used were Ultramarine Blue, Cerulean Blue, Yellow Ochre, Burnt Umber, Payne's Gray, Burnt Sienna, and I think Sap Green, as well as cadmium yellow light and maybe some cadmium red light. I also use masking fluid for the clouds, so I use that silicone tip brush to go ahead and block in my clouds. The first step I did is use a very pale yellow ochre to kind of do the trees in the foreground, if you look at the reference photo. I also use a really light wash of color to kind of make a wet backdrop so that I can add in, as you can see here, the green hilly areas on the far left. I usually work left to right. I'm right-handed, but if it's easier for you to work the other direction, of course, you can start on the right side. For watercolor, my usual philosophy is to work from lightest to darkest, so I am using a really pale green and yellow mix here to get in my tree shapes and to get in the hill in the background. So once I have that blocked in, I take my round brush, I think it's a 6, and I get some darker sap green. It's a little bit damp, but not super damp, and I start blurring and blotting with a paper towel a little bit to get that texture. I like to keep the brush semi-dry so that you get that pointed tree look. Then I start to go in on the foreground trees, and that's more of a sap green with a little bit of yellow ochre. And I notice that the shadows are mostly on the left side, so I start with the dark areas, which, I don't typically do, but with a wet brush, if you start with the dark areas and then blot it and blur it a little bit, you'll get that nice watercolor effect. And one of the things I've learned over time is that it's really important for trees especially to have that like gestural feeling, that kind of like, it's a little bit of a snap in your wrist to get that texture, that like sideways branchy texture. It might take a couple of tries to get used to, but go ahead and try doing these movements where you kind of dab at the paper with your brush in the same type of movement over and over again and kind of get those horizontal lines that make that tree branchy rough feel. The darker greens that I use towards the center of the canvas are it's Viridian, and there's also like something called an intense green or a phthalo green that are more blue. Or if you don't have those colors, you can always use ultramarine blue or a different blue that you have to get a cooler, darker green. And of course, to make it even darker than that, where the darkest shadows are, I mix burnt umber. And if you're really desperate to get a nice dark, a little bit of Payne's Gray will give you a nice dark green tree shadow color. And now my brush is a little bit drier and I start getting in more of those details. And it's really important for me to use a semi-dry brush to get in the details. That's where you get more control and you'll get less of that water blurring. So when I start in on the rocks in the background, I paint a wash of light Payne's Gray, and then this is mostly Payne's Gray with a tad bit of ultramarine blue for all the dark areas and all the shadows and cracks in the rock. After I paint the foreground in a pale sap green blend, then I head in towards the center of the tree, kind of get some dark branches there, and then I'm moving on to the rest of the tree details. For the tree trunks, I use a mix of Payne's Gray and burnt umber, and I like to paint negatively around where the white areas of the tree branch are, where the sun is facing. So you can see here I'm kind of avoiding certain areas that I want to keep white. And I'm also using this paint color mixture to get the really dark shadow areas in the central tree and the other spots in the area. If you can also notice here, I'm using a really small brush. It's a 000 brush with short bristles. It's the one I use all the time. I use a really small flat brush to get these dark shadow areas on the tree. I've noticed that a lot of the trees look pretty similar. I start off with sap green and then I add like the Viridian phthalo green in for like the brighter, darker shadows. In this area, I'm painting the dark areas that you can like see through the bushes with, or you can see through the trees to see the even darker areas behind them. So I go through when I have the whole foreground finished, I go ahead and add the darkest areas, those for last. And then I go ahead and I go back and forth between working on the central tree and then working on El Capitan, the mountain formation in the background. I start off with a really diluted Payne's Gray, and then I work in all of the details with my flatter, smaller brush. Those are great for those crags and those cracks in the rocks. Okay, on to the sky. I paint the background with water first until it's nice and wet, and then this is a pretty pure cerulean blue with a little bit of ultramarine mixed in. This always makes me really nervous to go ahead and do this whole sky because I really want it to be uniform, so I swish my brush back and forth pretty often trying to get it to be as uniform as possible. I use a smaller brush sometimes to get the blue in between the tree trunks. The next step is removing the liquid mask that's on top for the clouds. I use a special tool for that so that my fingers don't ruin the paper. And I don't love the cloud formation, so I use a little bit of white gouache to make it look more natural, as you can see here. You can also use a wet brush to kind of blur the clouds and make them look more natural and less like stark. And overall, I am pretty happy with this. I think it looks really similar to the picture. It's a little pale. The colors aren't as crazy as intense. This is my original painting that I did in acrylic a long time ago. In my head, it was a lot worse than this, but I like especially how the clouds look in acrylic. I think it looks better. But overall, I think the details in the watercolor are much, much more sharp. And that's the whole tutorial. And I hope you had so much fun and that you think about subscribing and check out my other tutorials and have an awesome day. Thank you.